What a wonderful partnership it has been between the Tennessee Trailers and Cleveland State Community College. I graduated from here just a few years ago. Please silence your cell phones, or I will have to give you the third grade teacher look. Welcome to the Trailers Educational Symposium, of course, co-sponsored by Tennessee Trailers and Cleveland State Community College. I am indeed Debbie Moore, President of the Tennessee Trailers. The Trailers Association has a twofold purpose. One, to provide educational opportunities for our members and the public. And two, to work on documenting the Trailers and acquiring signage. We would like to invite you to join the Trailers Association. Membership applications are available at the Tennessee Trailers table in the hallway. When you join, you not only provide manpower to do all of our work, but you also provide funding for more public activities such as this educational symposium. This morning we will have two back-to-back excellent speakers, and then we will break for lunch around noon. I'd like to invite you to stay on campus and eat lunch. It'll be nice and easy, and it's a short walk away. But food is available at the school cafeteria, and of course we have dozens of restaurants just a short driving distance away. Please return from lunch at 1:20. At this time, we have a very special guest. We will have Reba Rogers from Oklahoma. She's going to come forward and offer our blessing for today's activities. Miss Reba?
Stand. Intitolato Lisa, ispirito carne, iterei toi come, non resta di costa e tin custom to logisti. Nicolata, teutile. Iskristeren wel Oosterterritorisch stegen. Dat zijn ploegen hele stiegen. Dat het daar ook dienen, dat het daar door, dat waar dingen. Want het deed dan. Dat zijn nou niet altijd, daar geef je bezig. Kom eens weer, dat aan de kiezen, daar, nee, iets, toestel, is die sterk. Ostavuotijouksti čiaukienės vuotijusti. Skirtai gaidžiate, jau sakau, eignonai fana. Amen.
I thought y'all would enjoy hearing a prayer in the native Cherokee language. Thank you, Ms. Reba. Her son, by the way, is Will Chavez, and he's here. He is the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix. And we really appreciate him being here from Oklahoma. We have a lot of special guests here today, and I'm not even going to try to introduce you. I'm afraid I'll miss someone, but I know that we do have the president of the National Trailers Association, and he's also the president of the Oklahoma Historical Society, Jack Baker, here with us. We'd like to welcome him at this time, just with applause. Our first speaker today will be Sheriff Joe Guy from McMinn County, Tennessee. He will be lecturing on Jack Walker. Jack Walker was a local person who lived about 2 miles from here, I believe, and our beautiful Walker Valley is named after his family. Joe Guy was elected Sheriff of McMinn County in 2009 and serves as the McMinn County Historian. He is a renowned regional historian, nationally published author, and newspaper columnist.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for letting me come and speak. And I appreciate so much your interest and support of local and regional and really national history, what we'll talk about today. Trust me, after I'm done, the program just gets better than my presentation. I'm much more of an amateur historian and a storyteller, but this is, as I talk about this, I get to put on my. It's rare that my law enforcement hat and my historian hat get to come together, so it's been kind of neat to go back and look at a murder case almost 180 years old and reconstruct some of that, and I'll share that with you as we get close to this. And then the legal aspect of that is what to me is really interesting, and how this sort of laid a groundwork for the Trail of Tears to actually take place. Very humbled to be on the program with Brett Riggs. Brett, I consulted with him a little bit, and many of us have over the years, over my Fort Loudon book many years ago, and it's great to see him again. It's especially great to finally meet Troy Wayne Petit, because I am told that we look alike. And hey, I'll tell you, after looking at him, he's a good-looking guy. He's a good-looking guy. So it's just great to be here. Great to be with these two folks, and you will hear the scholarly stuff after I'm done. So we'll talk about this a little bit. How am I supposed to operate this? Am I just pushing buttons, or is there a controller? Looky there. That's it.
If it's on. We'll turn it on.
We'll figure this out in a minute. This is the one thing I didn't ask about.
Or you can just hit it right there.
I can do it, yeah. All right. So we'll start and talk briefly about some court decisions and things that were going on in Southeast Tennessee, North Georgia, and Washington. And what I want to talk to you about, we'll talk about court decisions. We'll talk about Jack Walker as a person. We'll talk about the murder, and then we'll talk about the trial and what came out of the trial, and thank you, and how that affected the Trail of Tears. There's another thing I want to notice about these court decisions, and these are extremely watered down for you today for the sake of time, is not only some of the language that came out in the court decisions, but who made the decisions, because that's going to play a role as we get closer to the actual Foreman trial. So Cornett versus Winston Leach, these are not an exhaustive list of court cases that affected the Cherokees back then. 1826, you can read there, Judge John Catron, you will hear his name again. And that's just part of his decision. He sided again with the Cherokees here. They were a people, and those are his quotes in the decision that he wrote, with acknowledged rights, which the courts of justice are bound to regard. And so we see this developing over the 1820s and early 1830s. The Supreme Court is agreeing more and more with some of the Cherokee claims. Now we know that presidents have been talking about removal way back. I mean, Thomas Jefferson talked about removal, so removal was nothing new under Andrew Jackson. So what was the big deal? Well, these court cases were starting to shore up Cherokee claims a little bit in our Supreme Court and the Tennessee Supreme Court. In Blair versus Pathkiller's lease, Judge Catron again upholds Cherokee property rights and kind of lays another plank for the Cherokees to be able to stand on, to say we're a nation, we're sovereign, we've got rights, we have our own government. In Holland versus Pack in 1823, Judge John Haywood, the noted historian, also says the Cherokees are yet an independent nation, subject to laws made by themselves. Does that sound to you like a sovereign nation? Absolutely it does, and the courts were friendly with the Cherokees. But here was the one that really got things going. This is the court case that seemed to really give passion to both the removal party and the treaty party, and that was Worcester versus Georgia, United States Supreme Court in 1832. Again, not to go into all of the details of what the case was about, but what came out of it. Georgia was trying, as you probably know, reach into the Cherokee lands and exercise some authority over them, and this case goes through the court system, gets to the Supreme Court, but they invalidated some, not all, but some of the laws that Georgia was trying to pass and over Cherokee land. Chief Justice John Marshall was the justice. He was still alive then. And he held that the Cherokee Nation was a distinctive community, very similar to what the Tennessee Supreme Court was saying, occupying, again, its own territory with boundaries, and the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter. And also some of those statutes had no right. Also, a part of this, I didn't quote him, but I just summarized it for you. He validated the treaties that had been made with the United States government and the Cherokees. Well, when you do that, you're saying if the United States can treat with these people, then they're recognizing them as a sovereign nation, as an independent people. And so that was big, that treaties were being recognized. And so as this case was released, then you started to see the development of the treaty group that said, hey, the treaties are being recognized, and so we can continue to treat and maybe retain some of our ancestral property. But you saw that division going, some of the groups going toward the treaty and some going toward just removal, seeing that maybe there's some benefits to this, maybe we need to take what we can get, looking down the road, maybe this isn't going to play out for us, because, again, it wasn't all just about the Supreme Courts. The courts were siding with them, but the presidents and many people in Congress and the Senate were not. And so it wasn't all a pretty picture as you might think right here. The courts were helping them out a little bit, but not necessarily the executive and legislative branch. So, who is Jack Walker? Well, you've probably heard of Major Walker, who was his father, who was a veteran of Horseshoe Bend. He had fought down there when Jackson took Cherokees down there to put down the Creeks, the Red Stick uprisings during the War of 1812. He was there with Sam Houston and Junaluska and all of the people that we read about that went down there with him. Jack John Walker Jr. is his son, and Major Walker is described in the historical record as dressing like a white man, but continuing to wear earrings and a nose ring. He was evidently fairly affluent. The fact that he is able to get a reservation on a river port that eventually became Calhoun is pretty, I think, pretty indicative of his place in the nation and as affluent that he was. So the Walkers were pretty affluent people. He initially names his little settlement Walker's Ferry, but he becomes a little enamored with the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, and around 1819 or so, I think he names Calhoun, that wound up as McMinn County was first formed. That's where our first courts were held, and the county was formed government was formed there in 1820. So he is the son of Major Walker. He winds up marrying Emily Stanfield Meggs. There's a pretty good little romantic story about Return J. Meggs literally chasing them up to Bristol when they go to get married, and they supposedly got married in the rain. I'm not sure if there's truth to that or not. They may be a little apocryphal, but it makes for a good story anyway. That he goes up, they go up there, and the preacher won't marry him in the church because he's an Indian and she's not, and so they marry him outside in the rain. Sounds good, and there may be some merit to that. So they come home, and sure enough, they build a home here in what is today Cleveland. There is a historical marker just right up the road here, and we'll see a picture of the site in a minute. Right across from the present Walmart up here just right out here, right out Paul Huff, on where Lee Highway and Paul Huff and Ocoee Street kind of come together. A big 2-story log house. He actually had a second Cherokee wife, which of course was not uncommon at that time. And he kept house with both of them at different times. He is described as a handsome man and a sharp dresser, and that turns up a couple of times in some of the research that I did. There is his house on the left, a sort of a painting from an old newspaper photograph when they were tearing it down not long after the start of the 20th century. And there's the site today. I took that picture just a couple of days ago, and looky there, we got a pointer. If I'm reading the historical record right, this house was torn down around 1900, and Cherokee Farms was built there, and with a bigger home was built on the site, and it was there for several years before it was torn down. But his grave was actually marked there for a long time. Now the historical marker is right in there. If I'm reading it right, the Cherokee farm home stood right about here where the church used to be. If they built that home on the Jack Walker home site, then it would have been right in there. And if that's true, he might be buried back here behind the tire place. But that's where that is, and that'll play a role in the story.
Who was his mother?
Who was his mother? You asked me a question that is slipping my mind. I don't remember what his. She was Nancy Ward's granddaughter. Betsy? No, let's see. I think it is Betsy. I think it is Betsy. Yeah. Thank you. I'll put that in there. Thank you. Thank you. In 1825, this is the first time that he and James Foreman kind of crossed swords. James Foreman was another mixed blood. He has a half-brother, Anderson Springston, that we'll see mentioned in a minute. And so in 1825, Foreman and some other men are trying to move some illicit whiskey, some brandy and some whiskey down the Conasauga River, no doubt bound to trade illegally in the Cherokee Nation. And they are stopped by Jack Walker, who at the time was a civil officer. He was sort of I've heard him mentioned as a constable or maybe even a sheriff. Later on, James Foreman is listed as a sheriff. But nevertheless, he had supposedly some authority. And when he stops them, and it's not just the two of them, they have groups of men with them, but Foreman demands to know what authority Jack Walker has to take his whiskey, and at that moment, Jack Walker points a pistol at him and says, "By God, this is my authority." They don't start off good. They don't like each other. Foreman specifically doesn't like Jack Walker, and again, both of them are officials within the Cherokee Nation. Both of them have some influence as we move forward. Walker began after 1830 to make some trips to Washington to visit with Andrew Jackson. And you see some of the guys that went along with him there, Starr and Van, at different times. He was entertained by Jackson. Once he actually came, I think after the Starr trip, he came back and found that there was a rumor that he and Starr had signed some of the land away. And he had to kind of go around and correct that because, as you well know, that was punishable by death, according to Cherokee law at the time. But he enjoyed going up there, evidently, and he enjoyed his role. I personally think he wanted to be sort of like a Ross and a Ridge and enjoyed moving in those circles. There's an observation made in the history of the Tennessee Supreme Court by Theodore Brown that Ridge and Ross never really endorsed these trips, that he was kind of going up there on his own and doing his own thing, and they kind of kept him at arm's length a little bit. As time moved on, he drifted closer and closer to the Ridges and the removal party. But he was kind of working on his own. They thought he was just kind of looking out for himself. So, we get down to August 18th, 1834. A council is being held at Red Clay, and all of the major players are there. The Rosses, the Vans, the Foremans, the Springstons, the Walkers, the Ridges, and there is a very heated discussion about the future of the nation and the leadership of the nation. During the council, James Foreman stands up and makes some very veiled threats. And he chose his words carefully, but it was clear kind of what he was saying about how the removal party were enemies of the nation. And that was sort of leaning toward those, again, the people that would sell land and be punished by death. The remarks that Ridge makes afterwards that I won't share with you today, they're in the historical record, you can see that it bothered him. And he addresses some of the things that James Foreman said about and how threatening some of those things were. But at some point, Jack Walker leaves. He leaves the council ground. Maybe he had had enough. Maybe he understood that he was in danger. He leaves with Dick Jackson. Now, here's where I put my police hat on for a little bit. All of these historical records talk about Jack Walker being shot after he left the council ground. But I kept noticing over the years when I'd write about this and look at it, the council starts on the 18th, and he doesn't get shot for 5 days on the 23rd. And also, his route was odd to me. He is coming up Spring Place Road from the southeast, and Red Clay is over more south of Cleveland. I thought, well, what's he doing way over there? Now, I'd seen a reference once about something about McNair's that is over on the old Federal Road or over on Highway 411 today, and the McNair graves are still there. And so we did a little more digging, and finally found the depositions of the witnesses that actually were part of the whole murder and or knew something about it. And they actually say he did not go back home. He didn't go north. He went south to Vans. And he spent a couple of days at Vans, he and Dick Jackson did. And then they come back, he's going back home, but he doesn't go straight up. He makes a little bit of a curve. It kind of goes over toward the east, and then he's going to go back up Spring Place Road, probably because he knew that his life was in danger and he is trying to avoid maybe some of those guys that are looking for him. So as you go up Spring Place Road and the historical narrative and the depositions from the witnesses all say, Muskrat Springs was right in that area where Cedar Springs Road kind of comes out there. There's a lot of water, a lot of spring-fed little lakes right in there. Muskrat's home was right in there that appears to be almost like maybe a halfway or a stopping point. And Dick Jackson's testimony was that as they're riding up through there, it's about 1 o'clock that they pass Muskrat's, and someone calls out to them and says, "Do you have any tobacco?" And so Dick Jackson says, well, he doesn't have any, talking about Walker, but I've got some. And so he rides back to Muskrat's and gives the guy that called to him a cigar. Well, when he rides back to Walker, Jack looks at him and says, "I feel like they were calling me back down there to kill me." And so they turn and begin to ride on out Spring Place Road. And according to the testimony, between a half a mile and a mile past Muskrat's, going back toward Cleveland today, is where the first shot rang out. So I went out there. Being a good police reconstruction guy that I try to be, and I just drove it and tried to figure out about where this might have taken place. And so this point here is where Shope Road angles off of Spring Place. And it looks to me like, you know how these, as the years pass by, the highway departments, they'll take the curves out of these old roads and straighten them out. Well, Shope Road is only about maybe 200 yards long. It cuts off of Spring Place and goes around and comes right back into Spring Place around this little curve. And it's sort of a little bit of an incline, and then that curve goes around, and there's a high bank over here on this side. And I'm telling you, this is purely just Joe Guy talking, okay? This is the area. That's all I'll say. I'm not going to say this is where it happened, but this matches up with the general area of where this would have taken place. So they're riding up through there. They hear a shot, according to Dick Jackson's testimony, that is behind them. And so they turn their horses, and then they see Anderson Springston and James Foreman, and that's when the second shot rang out, which seemingly was Foreman, and hit Jack Walker in the right chest. It was a large caliber rifle, probably a smoothbore, and I'm sorry, it wouldn't have been a smoothbore if it was a rifle. It was either a large caliber rifle or a smoothbore. But Jackson describes the wound as very clean going in, but very, very jagged going out, which is about the truth of the way they work. I don't see any specific witness saying that he actually even fell off of his horse, that he took that shot like that and was able to stay mounted. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I just don't see any reference to him falling off. But he shot, and they immediately turned and began a ride to his home that we just saw. Now, I drove that. I drove from right there at Shope Road in the area of Muskrat Springs, down Spring Place, through Cleveland, up Ocoee Street to about where the house was. And that's 10 miles. So he rode that evening for 10 miles with a gaping wound in his chest, bleeding a lot, but managing to stay in the saddle and get home. No doubt it doesn't say that he ran into anybody, but word got back down to, evidently there were still some meetings going on at Red Clay. Word got back to the groups down there that he had been shot. And so evidently there were some people down there, and they must have passed people on the road or passed other homes that knew them, and the word got out. So he makes it back to his residence, and just kind of collapses into his wife's arms as he comes in the door. And for the next 2 weeks or so, he suffers a lot because that's a really, really bad wound. But he is able to identify the two men that were involved in the ambush. He finally dies on, I don't have his death there, September 11th. And they bury him behind his residence in their orchard. He was also a Mason, and so they had two funerals for him, a Cherokee funeral and a Masonic funeral, and they laid him to rest back there. His father was still alive. It doesn't look like his father died until maybe the following year. So Major Walker is, of course, seeking revenge. He's immediately ready to go out and hunt down John Ross, who he blames for coordinating this whole killing. Ross goes back to his home, posts his guards around his home. The whole time that Jack Walker is suffering and dying, they've got guards placed around his home. And so already these animosities are starting to come up between these two groups. So
Do you think Ross was actually instrumental in that murder? Or?
do I think?
Yeah.
Well, I'm getting to that. Being identified, they are charged with an Anderson. Sheriff Spencer Beavers goes and arrests them. They bring them to court, and they hold court there in Athens. The jail where they were held. Let me go back here. This is Knight Park in Athens, and there's an old E.B. Madison was one of the city fathers back then, or in the 1940s, and who actually helped build this park. And in an old newspaper article, he talks about the calaboose that was on the north end of Knight Park. And so we think that the jail that Foreman and Springston were held in were up here on this upper point of Knight Park coming down from Depot Hill in Athens. So that would have been where they were held. They go to court. Their defense attorney is Spencer Jarnigan, and Spencer will later move out to Memphis and be one of the founding fathers of Memphis. He's actually buried out there. But his defense was to go back to those court cases that we started this presentation off with. And he said, they are in an independent nation. If this murder happened, he never denies it happened. If the murder happened, it was committed by Cherokees on another Cherokee in the Cherokee Nation, not in Tennessee. And so the Cherokee courts and the Cherokee laws would apply. You can't charge him, or you can't try him here. From his standpoint, it would be like if somebody killed somebody in Canada and we brought them down to Tennessee and put them on trial. I mean, we wouldn't even think of doing that. There are plenty of legal precedents that say you can't charge somebody for murder in some other country. And so Judge Charles Frazier hears that argument, being aware of some of the court cases that we've already seen, and he agrees. And he basically dismisses the case. We're not going to hear this. This is a case for the Cherokee courts, because he, like so many others in the judiciary, believed that the Cherokees were a sovereign nation, and they felt that there was legal precedent to substantiate that. Samuel Frazier was the DA. He did not see it that way. He felt like that this was it was McMinn County at the time, according to Tennessee statutes, was considered to go down across the river into the Cherokee lands, into what's today Bradley County. So from his perspective, he disagreed and said, I feel like that there's Tennessee law that says that we have jurisdiction down there. And so he appeals the case to the Tennessee Supreme Court that would be meeting the following summer in June of 1835. So Foreman and Springston, they try to get out of jail. Jarnigan makes a big impassioned speech to Judge Frazier to let them get out of jail. And it seems to me, just reading that, Judge Keith knew he had murderers in his presence, in his courtroom, and he went about just to let them go. So he remands them back to custody of Sheriff Beavers there in McMinn County, and they're placed back in jail. And they sit in jail for a little while. At one point, they did escape, and there is the newspaper reward for them. John Austin, the jailer, says that they escaped on March, I think, the 31st. And he describes them. It's kind of interesting. They are both large, dark half-breeds. Foreman's very tall and rather of a slender make. Springston is not so tall and is heavy and stout built. I think that's the only physical description I've ever seen of those two guys. So they find them, put them back in jail. John Ross The lady asked the question, was John Ross part of this? It's interesting that John Ross raised the bail money and paid the attorney fees. So you can put one, 2 and 2 together about that. He was certainly trying to get them out of jail and certainly trying to make sure that they were defended in this court case. So again, you can consider that on your own. So they go in June. They appear in Knoxville. Now here's where things get interesting. The Supreme Court meets, and it's the justices are John Catron that we've already seen. Do you all remember his court decisions supporting Cherokee rights and Cherokee as a nation? Judge Catron, Judge Green, and Judge Peck hear the case. Judge White was on the Supreme Court, but he is not there for some reason. So just those 3 justices hear this case. They hear it. It takes Catron a little while to write a very lengthy opinion. Green agrees with him. It's a 2-to-1 vote, or 2-to-1 decision. Peck dissents. Peck goes back like Charles Fleming Keith in Athens and says there's plenty of statutes and case law saying that it's an independent nation. It's a sovereign nation. They ought to be able to retry this case down there. But Green and specifically Catron say no. And you see what Catron says right there, and it's a very, very lengthy opinion, but we've got copies of it. Calls the Indians savage beasts and heathen lands, and he plays the Christian card. And says, the principles declared in the 5th century, I'm sorry, that should be the 15th century, that's a mistake on my part, the 15th century as the laws of Christendom, that discovery gave title to assume sovereignty over and to govern the unconverted natives. If you didn't convert to Christianity, you were considered conquered and not sovereign. And so neither our theory nor practice, y'all remember what he decided in those other court cases, don't you? It's like a different guy's writing this. Neither our theory nor our practice has ever allowed the Indians any political right extending beyond our pleasure. So he completely flips on this court case. Green decides with him, and so they remand the case to be retried, not in the Cherokee Nation, but in McMinn County. So basically saying the Cherokee Nation has no government, has no legal recognized government, has no legal recognized laws or court system or anything else except the state of Tennessee. If the state of Tennessee overrules all that. And so you remember how we started out here with a murder case and now we're deciding whether a nation is sovereign or not? That's why this case is so important. But the case is never heard. We have about 95% of our court documents in McMinn County. Our courthouse did burn, but it didn't burn until the 1960s. And it burned from the top down, and so they were able to get all the records out. We have very, very few records missing. This never shows up in our court records, that it ever went back and was retried. In October, the decision is published. About that time, there is a council being going on, as you well know, in Red Clay. They reject removal. They reject the removal treaty, but by December, they have reconvened another council with less Cherokees present in New Echota and are able to slip that through and get the removal treaty signed, and the Trail of Tears begins. And so I agree with what we'll see here in just a minute, how important this case was that really started the Trail of Tears. When we do historical tours in Athens, we'll do a little downtown walking tour sometimes, and I do some of those, and we always start in front of the courthouse, and I always tell people, on that courthouse square, in the very first courthouse that was in Athens, the Trail of Tears began. And I have to explain that, because they're like, Sheriff, what are you talking about? But I go into a little condensed version of the court case that started out right there, wound up in Knoxville, and it was supposed to come back, but it never did. So, why did Judge Catron's opinion change? That's a big. Why would a guy who ruled for so many years in favor of the Indians suddenly call them dirty names and say you're nothing, legally nothing, and go against some of his own decisions? Well, again, I'll go back to Theodore Brown's book and just the fantastic research that's done there, and who, by the way, is an Etowah, Tennessee native. And I'll go to his quote here. He says, Catron viewed the case as providing opportunity to facilitate the success of President Andrew Jackson's popular removal policy at a crucial time during pending treaty negotiations with the Cherokee. So the question is raised, were Jackson and Catron in collusion together? Interesting. Well, let me let you guys look at this. On Jackson's last day in office, he makes some Supreme Court nominations. Only one of them is accepted and approved. Guess who? John Catron. Catron also supported slavery. He was one of the Supreme Court justices that voted in favor of the Dred Scott decision. Oddly enough, when the Civil War came around, he was actually against secession in Tennessee. But you see, he's not always the nicest guy in the world. The only child he ever fathered was a relationship with a slave, and as far as I can find anyway. So he was a very convoluted, up and down kind of guy about what he believed. So you see the connection. You can draw your own conclusions from that, but it's just kind of interesting that he winds up on the Supreme Court after he makes this decision. And you might put yourself in Jackson's shoes. You know, he knew John Walker. I didn't put it up here, but there's a pretty lengthy quote that he sends to the Indian agent at the time about Walker's murder and how upset he is over it. And so he probably did see an opportunity to move this along. He is at the end of his presidential term. He wants removal done. He sees this court case. He knows John Catron.
So this frames a lawless view of the Cherokee Nation.
A lawless view?
Yeah.
Somewhat. They certainly don't recognize the advances that they had made. Yeah.
So what would have been, had it been just, had the Cherokee been allowed to have the judicial jurisdiction of that, what would have been the likely outcome? Would they have been sent down to?
Well, at the time, if they had recognized their government as a nation, it would have held up removal for who knows how long.
But as far as the murder itself, what would have been the...
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good point, and I was going to mention that. We were talking about how this affects removal, but remember, a murder happened. There's been a killing, and that case is supposed to be retried regardless whether the Indians are moved or not. And you have to ask again, how did Walker's family feel about this? There were Cherokees killing Cherokees. But the trial is still supposed to take place, and it never does. And nobody is ever prosecuted. Foreman and Springston never deny that they killed Walker. But they're never taken back to court. But yeah, it was Cherokees on Cherokees. Let's see. Just a final little point here. I think this is kind of sad. Walker his family, they never get to put anybody in jail. They never get to see this go to court, not in the Cherokee Nation nor in Tennessee courts. Walker's grave is eventually lost. As again, they tear that house down. They rebuild another house. You see this newspaper picture of a marker that was placed there by the DAR that stayed up for many years, but it was torn down when Highway 11 was widened, and so it's gone. And so the specific location of his grave is really, we don't know where it is, if it's even there anymore because of all the development. There's a possibility, again, just based on reading up on where everybody says everything was back then in regard to the houses, that it might be in that field back behind the tire place. And I'll be interested to maybe talk to some other folks about some things we can do to look into that. But that is basically my presentation. Yes?
In some of my research, there are Catrons related to Nancy Ward that were actually pushed out in the removal to Oklahoma. Are they related to this Catron?
She said there are some Catrons related to Nancy Ward in some of her research. I've never seen that. Catron was from Sparta, Tennessee, and went over to that's where he's originally from, went to Nashville, practiced law, wound up being a Tennessee judge and Tennessee Supreme Court justice. I've never seen any connection or any reference to that. Yes, sir.
Have you done any comparisons between the Tennessee legislation and rulings from the bench compared to the Georgia legislations and the rulings from their bench?
No, not except just kind of a cursory examination of the points of those cases, because most of this was about what was going on in Tennessee.
Because theirs was several years ahead of
Yes.
what's going on in Tennessee.
Yeah, they were sort of driving
They had already declared them to be.
Yeah. Tennessee was much kinder to the Cherokees than Georgia was. Somebody had yes, ma'am.
Why would even half-breed Cherokee before removal?
Why would even a half-breed Cherokee be for removal? Again, I think we have mispainted the Trail of Tears sometimes. I think we get this image in our head that they just rounded everybody up and made them move out west. When this happened, there are already thousands of Cherokees living out west. They've already voluntarily removed. The Starr family from my county that Starr Mountain's named for have long been out there making a living for themselves. Some Cherokees considered that to be an opportunity to get away from the white government, to go out there on new land and start new, build a new government, build a new nation, and some of these other guys, I'll be curious to see what they say. To me, it seems like that was mostly a lot of the affluent half-breed seemed to be more, let's go out west. And a lot of the full-bloods seemed to stay and, oddly enough, get behind John Ross, who was a mixed blood and didn't even speak the language. But he spoke to those people. And he understood what they wanted, and they were able to identify what, he's saying, hey, maybe we can get our land back, maybe we can stay. And there's arguments about, did he mislead people, or did he not to mean to mislead people, but it just wound up like it did? I mean, who knows? But yeah, a lot of Cherokees wanted to go out west. I mean, they went with, nobody pointed a bayonet at the Stars and made them go out west. They voluntarily took that opportunity that was offered by the federal government to go out there and start new.
Some returned too, because that terrain was so different.
Yes, some did return. Mr. Hildebrand that identified Nancy Ward's grave is a good example of that in Polk County. He came back and just shortly after immigrating and lived the rest of his life in Tennessee. So some Cherokees did come back. Yes, Ivy?
That was a substantial grave marker. I mean, look at the size of it. How does something like that just, with a plaque, where do you think that plaque disappeared?
Maybe somebody here knows. I'm like you. How did that get lost?
We think that it was put underground at that intersection because it was easier to hide it than it was to move it. It just disappeared one night.
Just disappeared.
Yeah, while the road was being lined. Let's take one more comment.
Yes, sir.
Many years ago, wasn't there a historical marker at Riceville that said that Chief Jack Walker had been killed there on old Highway 11?
It was lost.
I don't remember anything about that one.
That was stolen too.
Yeah. Those are not all factual, by the way, but oddly enough. Yes?
Did you mean Isaac or Anderson? I saw both names up there.
Okay, he's listed both ways, and I probably copied and pasted something and left. I always like to say Anderson. He seems like he shows up Anderson more than anything. Yes, sir.
How do you feel this violence here that's occurring in Tennessee? And it relates. My understanding, I had always envisioned a type of civil war that developed between the removal and the nation faction and the removal faction in Oklahoma.
Yes.
Was that actually a quasi-war, or was it more like Hatfields and McCoy?
It had its roots right here, and it played out there. Foreman and Springston would eventually be killed. I think by Stan Wattie. I think he killed both of them later on. Yes, sir.
The Cherokee blood law did eventually prevail. Springston both murdered.
Yeah. And that went all the way up into the 1840s or 50s until they finally settled most of that. I think my time's out. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
I was a good on.
Take about 10 minutes to get Troy Wayne set up, so if you need to stand up and stretch, let's feel free to do that. Wonderful crowd, very attentive, we appreciate it. And you see why I invited Joe in.